3 on workflows, and the focus for today is the workflow types admin library, the options available, and where to start when first building a new workflow. Because of the nature of workflows and how customizable they can be, it's a tricky area to cover completely in the time that we have, but we will cover as much of the basic important points to note and helpful suggestions that we can. We'll briefly go through the admin library main points before reviewing a sample workflow and the component set for it to give a little bit more context. As with all admin libraries, they're accessible via the admin menu, in this case, admin workflow types. The first page, General, contains, as per usual, the location of the code and description for the workflow type. Next is the version type, for which you should always select version 2. Version 1 is legacy functionality, so no new workflow should be created using it. Then we have the target, and in the last session you may recall we mentioned there are 3 different types of workflows, and the target is where this is set, so we can either select account client or account application from the list. What is selected here will be determined by the overall purpose of the workflow and the functionality required for the process. For example, only account workflows have the ability to have items like the account restructure or account payment arrangement, and obviously processes requiring that particular item functionality would be accounts themselves anyway. So naturally, the target would be account. Optionally, a category can be set with the list being maintained by the workflow categories information list, which you can open by clicking this button here. An icon can also be set if desired. The next section is important and defines what account statuses workflows can be created for. This obviously only applies to account and account application type workflows, and it's also important to note that the setting is only enforced in the user interface, so in theory can be overridden or ignored by the business layer. It's designed to limit what can be added by the user and prevent incorrect workflow types being added inappropriately. The workflow restrictions allow the option of stopping multiple workflows of the same workflow type, meaning the same code or record, so multiple od.sample workflows is an example, being opened on the same account, client or application at a time, which is a good way of preventing accidental duplication by users, which could result in duplicated communications going out, which is not ideal. Likewise, you can limit the amount of open workflows within a specific category. So if you had multiple debt collection workflows, you could limit to only one being open at a time, so they progress as expected through the relevant workflows, and again, avoid accidental duplication or user error. And finally, whether or not a closed workflow can be reopened, and the notes section, which can be handy for adding in some additional handy context, like I've done here. Our options page covers settings relating to the allocation method and weighting percentage. These are utilised by script for automatic allocation. A sample script is available to show one way of using this, being the script attached here, the WFA sample script for workflow allocation. The weighting option is used by the script in conjunction with the user weighting set on the users page, which we will see soon. The sample script covers the proportional option, which will even the number of workflows across the users based on weightings, etc. It's not mandatory to use this functionality and completely depends on the needs of the business and the workflow type or purpose as to what is appropriate. Also on the options page is the ability to define an information list for specific close outcomes if desired. And the script language can be changed here from Visual Basic to C# if appropriate, and the timeouts. The other options cover whether or not to include in the account processes under the workflow processing section, and whether to include even if not recalled, example on a wait item. Whether to close workflows when the account is closed, whether to automatically close and move the workflow back to the original account if a refinance is cancelled, and whether to clear defined monitor categories upon closure of the workflow. There is also 3 available user flags that can be utilised via scripting. The summary script page allows both the overriding of the standard summary page by script and the defining of the viewable options for the standard summary page. It's important to note the key details script should not be defined here, as this will call the summary script, which you define here, which is a common mistake. For example, some of the other standard options here are to show the train stop diagram, which we covered in our session last week, or to not. The new workflows page sets defaults for new workflows as they're added of this type, such as the flag color, the default allocated user, which is optional. Some sites may choose to deliberately leave them unallocated, and users pick up workflows based on age out of the unallocated workflows list. Also available is whether or not the workflow is initially left pending until a user has physically seen it and changed its status, meaning it won't process, which in some circumstances may be desirable. Next is the initialization, so essentially what will happen once that workflow is added, whether it be manually or by account type rules, etc. This workflow is set to add the first item group, which simply adds all workflow items in that first item group. This means the workflow initially will only show that first group, and the others won't show until they're added if they reach that part of the process. The none option will be used if scripting is used to manage the initialization. Add all will add all workflow groups and items from the outset. Add to item group will add all workflow items and groups prior to and including the specified group. And the easiest way to see how this looks and works is to test them out and work out which one best suits the business and this process. The other option available for new workflows is to suppress the alert created when a new workflow has been created if it's not allocated to that user. Next is the items page, and this is the real business page where the major construction takes place, where we add our groups, their outcomes, and their items. As you can see from our sample here, they're structured with a folder and subfolder looking structure, which allows you to see how things are grouped easily and making it easy to collapse them so you can focus on one group at a time as you're building or editing your workflow and so on. The button strip along the bottom comes alive once you're in edit mode, and hovering over each of these buttons like this will tell you what each button does. For example, this first button here, being the large blue folder with a green plus sign, will add an item group and launch the new workflow item group wizard, which will walk you through adding a new group, and we'll examine this closer a little bit later. The next button adds an item itself. We went over the item types last week, but as a refresher is the process parts of the workflow, such as credit inquiries, weights, tests, sending documents, questions, decision cards, payment arrangements, etc. Again, we'll review the new workflow item wizard closer in a little bit. The other buttons include inserting items before the selected item, deleting a selected item, duplication of an item, arrow buttons to move the order of the items around, standard cut, copy and paste buttons, import and export, showing or hiding the warnings, and showing or hiding the summary page down the bottom, and our standard save options button. The users page allows the definition of both roles and users that can be allocated a workflow of this type. In this example here, I have selected the collector role, and we can see here that we have 2 users defined who are able to have an od.sample workflow allocated to them. Other users in the collector role will still be able to have them allocated to them, and users defined here that are not in the collector role will also be able to as well. If this page is blank, any user can have this workflow type allocated to them. Again, the proportions are used by the workflow allocation script. Recall events. Options on this page control what events will set the recall immediately flag, bringing the workflow back for user attention based on your task manager configuration. Available options are when a log is created, when a transaction is created, when a payment due transaction is created, when a payment received transaction is created, payment arrangements, when suspension details have been updated, when a payment method is updated, when account has been restricted, when a bank account inquiry report or pending credit inquiry is downloaded or deleted, when an electronic signature is completed or deleted, and when an SMS message's status has been updated or a reply is received. This last one was added specifically for the advanced messaging module. To view which of these particular actions has set the recall immediately flag, you can click the detail button on the general page of the workflow form itself or in Task Manager on the summary screen. It will show an alert. The user-defined page allows the definition of custom parameters, a page set or a parameter set if required, to enable the user to record additional data. This information is then stored in the workflow user data and can be utilised by script if desired. To show an example, I've included a simple checklist parameter, which ends up looking like this, which a user could manually tick off via the user-defined page. We have seen this area used in a variety of ways, and because of its highly customizable nature, in particular the user data itself, it's a useful way to build highly customized solutions with scripting to gather and populate information for users where appropriate. The script code page is self-explanatory. As you can see, this particular sample has no scripting at all and is using completely out-of-the-box functionality to take a user through a basic overdue process. Scripting can be very useful for workflows, however, as this is where higher levels of automation can be achieved and much more. Next session is around scripting and workflows, so we'll leave it to the experts to delve deeper into this topic then. Constants, like with any script, can be added to make changes easier at a user interface level. So if a workflow is to involve scripting, seriously considering what can be added as constants to make ongoing maintenance easier is a must. The permissions page, again, relatively self-explanatory, but here we can define for the specific workflow type who can create, edit, close a workflow, or update user-defined fields once a workflow is closed. There is also the option for the workflow to run with administrator permission, which allows the user who would not otherwise have access to a specific process to complete the action via a workflow. This can be very useful for locking things down if the business decision is that certain things should only be completed via a workflow. The grid below here will show you which roles or users have access based on the permission selected. For example, if we have a look here, this menu.admin permission currently is denied for all roles. And if you click on the users tab, it'll show you that only administrators can perform that particular action. The usage page, again, fairly self-explanatory, but this page will show you where a workflow type is defined throughout FinPower Connect for use. So here we can see the account type rules coming through. Audit, this page will display any audited change to the workflow type record. The settings for what events are audited are in global settings. So, starting point and a closer look. As I may have mentioned about 50 times in the last several sessions and topics, I'm a strong believer that before you start constructing a workflow, you need to have both a good understanding of and well-documented resources for the processes intended to streamline. So I thought we would review the groups and items based on our sample in conjunction with some process chart examples to add some context to what we're looking at. Personally, I find decision tree or flowcharts useful as a visual tool to see what the steps are, the consequential actions of those steps, and it really helps to identify the FinPower Connect components that need to be added and where, making it much easier to create the groups and their items in a logical and clean way. Without this process map or documentation to refer to, it's possible to create dead ends, which means having parts of a workflow that end up going nowhere or accidentally building results that cause a workflow to become stuck in a loop, adding the same things on repeat incorrectly. Breaking this down to a minute detail helps the person building the workflow or workflows immensely. So it's a team effort to construct workflows that will really work for a business. A collaborative effort between those in the direct processes, for example, for a loan origination workflow, that might involve the lenders handling the day-to-day and understanding where an account needs to go based on conditions or criteria. The documentation team, if separate, the credit managers and the technical people building the workflow itself is needed to ensure all eventualities are catered for. For example, you may initially receive a process map that is a bit too basic, like this one here. This example shows a basic flow of a collections process, but there's lots that it doesn't show. It's likely receiving a process map like this would have many follow-up questions required from the technical people not in the day-to-day process to find out a bit more about what is actually required on several levels, like FinPower Connect physical options that would be normally completed manually that we're now hoping to automate or streamline by building a workflow, to reporting requirements and questions around documentation, how the process starts and ends, and what processes exist before and after this one. A deeper look from this process chart here, you can see I've mapped this out using the basic workflow format. This is just one example of how a process can be mapped out and then fleshed out further still, starting with that basic process chart and hypothetically asking the right questions to find out what the actual steps and requirements were, could end in a process map looking like this. The green boxes are the group, the yellow boxes are the items within the groups, and the red boxes are our group outcomes. Obviously, if I zoom right out, you can see all 4 groups of our workflow have been mapped with their items and the flow they follow depending on what happens throughout the workflow's progression. But you won't be able to read that. So if we briefly focus on our first group, you can see the starting point here being the account type rule. So in theory, this first step was decided based on the original process chart, which has the first step as account misses payment. The account type rule is set to start off the OD sample workflow if it meets the rule conditions of not being in a current OD monitor category and being more than 2 days overdue. The workflow then adds the first group as its items, which, in line with the original process chart, will attempt to send an SMS automatically, and if it cannot, will appear in Task Manager for a user to complete an outgoing call. After an SMS is sent or a call is made, the original process states the R1 letter is to be sent when the account is approximately 3 to 7 days overdue. So in this case, the way we've handled that is via a wait item set for 2 days and then an automatic overdue test. If the account is still overdue, the workflow moves on to automatically send the R1 letter. We also added an item to update the monitor category, which hypothetically we also discovered was a requirement on further probing of that initial process documentation received. The next big events in the process involve attempting to make a payment arrangement and sending of the R2 letter, which doesn't happen until the client has had about a week to attempt contact with the lender or pay their arrears. So logically, it's a good time to end group 1, following another wait item and overdue test, which brings us to the settings of group outcomes. We know we're going to need another group for the next step, so logically this will be one outcome, but we also need to consider what other outcomes are required. Logically speaking, we also know that if an account is no longer overdue, no further collection action would be required. So this leads us to have an outcome of account not overdue with an action of closing the workflow. You may remember last week I mentioned that items can set an overall group outcome, which in this case our overdue tests do, to cater for closing the workflow at that point, which is appropriate. For our third outcome, we've also built in an escalate option, which can be manually chosen once the first group reaches its end and hits the group outcome. And a user can manually select it should they deem appropriate for it to do so. For example, if a complaint were received and it wasn't immediately appropriate to continue to group 2. So let's review these in more detail on the workflow type form itself to show how we've completed this using the group item wizards, etc. So if we right click on our first group overdue process and go to properties, we can see that the workflow item group wizard launches. And on our first page, we have a few options to consider. We've set a description, which is mandatory. No code in this case, but if you wanted to add this group and its items again later in the process or have a scripted action, a code is a must. The balance of the options depend completely on the process itself as to whether they're required or appropriate. For example, the option to allow users to flag items is not applicable or not, whether or not the group itself is automatic, and whether the group items need to be completed in order. The notes field is a great way to add text prompts for the user if required. On the next page, it offers the option to repeat the item group for each account client. This option is also available at an item level, so in most cases it would be ticked at the item level rather than the group, I'd imagine. But again, it depends on what is appropriate for this process and that lender's business practices. We can then force notes entry with options of text notes, parameters, user-defined, etc. And finally, our outcomes. So the description of what will appear for the user to select is what will appear for the user to select should they reach the end of the group. These outcomes can get quite technical using the success, true, false options and the available actions. In our example, we can see that if a user selects escalate for review, the action it's going to complete is adding the item group review and subsequent items. If account not overdue is manually selected or met by our overdue test item, which we'll look at closer shortly, the action being completed is the closing of the workflow. And finally, the adding of the next item group OD.2 if the account is still overdue and the normal collections process is to continue. There are many actions available, and it has its own little wizard to help you create an outcome. Whilst we haven't used the option in this group, if we look at the outcome options here, there is an option to set an outcome of any fail, which means that any item that has a fail outcome would trigger this outcome option. The other options are all success, any success, all fail, or default. You can define if the outcome is defined as a success outcome or not, which ties in with the other update section for an item on an item for things like updating flag colors, etc. And you can choose whether to hide the outcome from a user so that it cannot be manually chosen but can still be utilized via script and the action that this outcome will perform. As you can see from this list, the possibilities are vast, and as a result, you can get very clever with workflows and what they can do based on lots of little settings. And the other updates page, you can choose to update the flags and or monitor categories on successful completion of the item group. So if one of your items itself is to set a monitor category, like ours is, you could look to clear the monitor category on successful completion if the account was paid up to date, as an example. Now looking at the items themselves, if we take a quick look at the first first at the overdue test item. Again, if you right click and go to properties, it'll launch our workflow item wizard to take us through the available options. We can see that this item type is test, obviously, and again, we have the description, the code, and the short description. The short description is used in summary pages and train stop diagrams when necessary, and the code, as mentioned previously, is used by scripting. Like with the overall group settings, we have the ability to hide the item in the summary pages and whether or not they can set the item to not applicable or not. We can see here on this item, we have it set as automatic, meaning no user intervention is required for the item to be performed, making this a quick and easy way for a workflow to drop off a user's work list should the arrears be resolved. As mentioned earlier, the individual items also have the option to repeat for the account clients, which may be appropriate for document items and notes entry, etc. This item page, this item type, has a page to set the test conditions. And in our case, we're reviewing whether or not the account is still overdue. So we've selected check overdue status, and we're checking the overdue days specifically. You can also optionally enter threshold and values if desired. Also displayed on this page is the other test types that are available, like testing, the contractual overdue, and so on. Next is the monitor category tests, which aren't relevant to us in this case, but it is another definable check you can set if desired. And finally, on our outcomes page, we can set the workflow to closed if it fails the test, meaning that the account is no longer overdue by at least 1 day. And as you can see, we've selected the action for the false outcome as complete item group with outcome account not OD, which, as we know from our review of that group, will carry out the action to close the workflow. Setting the group outcome also allows the closure of the workflow as soon as it fails that still overdue test, again meaning that no action is processed further at that point. That would either be inappropriate or needlessly taking up the time of a collection staff member that could be on to the next workflow to action or call. Looking at a different item this time, for example, the R1 letter, we can see the item type is send document. This obviously means that the subsequent available pages in the workflow item wizard will be different, allowing the definition of the required information we need to send said R1 letter. When we get to the document page in the wizard, you can see we've selected the R1 document, surprise, surprise, and there are subsequent document items available, such as the publish immediately option. There is usually some confusion around this, as on the first page it's noted as automatic, which means that the workflow item will be processed automatically, and in the case of send document, it means it's queued for publishing the next time the published document wizard is run, which for large businesses makes a lot of sense. Whereas the publish immediately flag allows the document to be published instantly when the item is manually actioned, which for smaller businesses may be desirable, particularly if their collection staff physically print and mail the letters themselves, as an example. The Customize Documents Parameters option allows further settings to be set later on where applicable. Next is the document log default, where a specific subject can be overridden. If this is left blank, it's automatically generated from the document itself. You can optionally choose to delegate the document logs themselves to a user or role if desired, like I have here. Again, this is dependent on the requirements of the business for their internal processes and reporting purposes, etc. You'll notice this item type does not have the option to set a group outcome, because there isn't the same ability to have a true-false outcome set. So once the item is completed, it simply moves on to the next item in the list, which in our case is the update monitor category item. If we have a look at this one, you'll see it's set as a none item, which is often how we can add items with scripted actions in conjunction with the item's code. In this case, however, we're just using a none item to simply set a monitor category. I thought I'd briefly touch on the alternatives option here and how it's achieved, as it's not immediately obvious. You can see from our very first item is an SMS, but is under the header alternatives only perform the first actionable item. You might remember in our processor chart, it was an SMS or an outgoing call, not both. So this is how we handle an or option. On the second item here, there is an option to tick keep with previous, only use if the previous item could not be actioned. So that is how we achieve that. We could be here for years going through each item type, and we simply don't have the time. As with everything, the easiest way to understand how this all works is simply to test it. And if you're unsure or would like further specific training in this area, feel free to contact support. As for this particular workflow, it is available with the demo data shipped with FinPower Connect. So I encourage you to review it, test it, make changes to it, or create your own workflow to familiarise yourself with the area. The best thing you can do once you've built a workflow is to test every eventuality described in the process documentation against your workflow to ensure what happens is as expected, to confirm your configuration is correct. Again, as mentioned last week, your Intersoft dealer can also supply quotes to build workflows for the lender, working closely together to get the best results. So we've come to the end of our session for today. As always, if there's any additional information you seek, don't hesitate to contact application support for user interface queries or code support in relation to code-specific questions, as there's many scripting events and functions available throughout many processes involved with these for custom requirements. Next week, our code team will be running a session for you on scripting and workflows, being the final session on workflows for this training series.